Hi, Martin Manconi. Welcome back again to our show. Today we have a very special guest, Mnar Muhawesh. Mnar is the CEO, owner, and founder of probably one of the most important independent news media outlets online. It's MintPress.com. How are you doing today, Mnar?
Good. How are you?
Great, thank you. Mnar, I wanted to give a brief introduction because I want you to take us through. You have a phenomenal life story that's taken itself into how you work as an activist journalist. So tell us, where were you born? Where'd you go to school?
Sure, I'll be happy to share that information.
Thank you.
I was actually born and raised here in Minneapolis, Minnesota, to Palestinian American immigrants. And when I was at the age of about 9 years old, my parents decided to pack up our family and move us overseas to Jerusalem, where they were originally from. They really felt the need to educate us about our culture as indigenous Palestinian people living under Israeli occupation, and learn more about our heritage and traditions and religion, etc. And so we moved overseas to Jerusalem, and little did I know and realized that we were going to be moving into apartheid and under Israeli occupation. I was obviously very young and very naive, and had very much the same kind of stereotypes that most Americans have about the Middle East. It's backwards, and people are still stuck in like the 16th century and so forth. But when I lived there, I witnessed firsthand human rights abuses and crimes committed against humanity under the Israeli government. I would go to school with my parents and to find half of the school children in my class missing because they were being denied an education. They were being blocked from crossing checkpoints if living in Ramallah or other cities in the West Bank. And the school was in Jerusalem under Israeli territory. And there were days when we would cross through checkpoints ourselves, and I would witness as a young girl children being shot at with rubber bullets, elderly being blocked and the disabled being blocked from going and getting medical treatment at hospitals because they didn't have a permit. We witnessed homes getting demolished, entire families getting kicked out of their homes and getting occupied and stolen by Israeli settlers. So it was very, very traumatizing for me as a young preteen. And so eventually it was too difficult to bear for us as Americans. We had already been accustomed to American traditions and way of life. And so my parents actually decided to move us back to the United States when I was about 12 years old. And from there, the damage was already done. I had experienced PTSD and survivor's guilt, the same as which military servicemen and women experience when they return home from war. All I could think of was the war that I had left behind, and the trauma, and the children in my school that that were living every day just to survive. And so this coincidentally was the same year that September 11th happened. So just as I had come back to the United States, escaping that war in Palestine, I didn't realize again that we were entering a new war here in the United States as Muslim Americans, as Arab Americans. I had turned to the media to keep up to date to what was happening back home in Jerusalem, only to find the media painting the picture of course, Israel as this beacon of democracy and human rights in the Middle East. And Palestinians were, the imagery that they showed of Palestinians were people bearing guns, covered faces, and just dehumanizing images of Palestinian people. And so those were the first images that I had received when I had come back to the United States. I was completely distraught as a preteen and thought, it's the media that is making Americans so uneducated and unaware about the crisis in Palestine. And of course, within a couple of months, I'll shorten up my story, September 11th happened. And just like I had turned to the media to figure out what was going on in Palestine, I had again witnessed the media beating the drums of war and blaming 1.6 billion Muslims on the action of the 6 hijackers that had flown the planes into the World Trade Center. And so there we were again, and I felt extremely ostracized and just like many Muslim Americans, I was bullied in school. But through these trials and tribulations and through this struggle, I turned to the media and I found courage and catharsis to pursue journalism, in the sense that we have a moral obligation to educate people about the true costs of war, whether it be the war on terror in the Middle East or the war that Palestinians are living to survive every single day. And that's why I chose to become a journalist.
The work that we're always trying to do is get the message out about our country has been in an endless war for over 30 years that is attacking only Muslim people. And when you simplify it that easily, I just have to say probably one of the dumbest things I could possibly say is the ignorance that Muslims must think Americans have. Because we've gone through so many stories of whether or not it's Native American Indians or if it's Southeast Asians, where we've just had genocide after genocide after genocide. And with all of the knowledge and education that Americans have, we have to look inhumane and immoral to Muslims in the Middle East. And that's one of the main reasons I wanted to bring you on the show, because you are so good at articulating this dualism that's occurring right now. So could you put into your words, as people are listening, the pain that you've had in your heart and you're seeing it with your family and friends living in Palestine, and moving that into raising a consciousness for people who consider themselves world citizens?
Absolutely. I mean, as I mentioned before, I had found courage and catharsis in pursuing journalism because I really saw this struggle. I mean, the more I talked about what I had left behind in Palestine and the more I tried to educate people, it felt like I was talking to a brick wall. Most people have no idea what's happening in the Middle East. And of course, America's not just at war in the Middle East, but it's, throughout Africa, and it's waging other kinds of war with Ukraine, or with Russia, in China. But more specifically, we have 6 corporations that currently control over 90% of what Americans see, hear, and breathe. And the very entities that are profiting from war, that are waging these wars, and that are destabilizing these nations overseas, just so happen to be the new owners of the media. And that is, of course, since the 1990s, when President Bill Clinton encouraged neoliberal economic policies. We have all of these corporations that were meant to be held accountable by the media now owning and controlling the media. So we have a very well prepackaged message about what's happening overseas with these wars. And the way that our media and politicians always frame it is that it's a defensive war, that we are protecting ourselves. People overseas hate us for our freedom, hate us for our way of life. And oftentimes we're bombarded with images of women that are oppressed overseas, and we frame the hijab, of course, as a form of oppression, when in reality it's a form of modesty and a rejection of the corporatization and sexualization and selling of the woman's body in the American press. And so these kinds of ideas and these caricatures that are being painted about Muslims are used to legitimize these military actions abroad. And of course, people argue and say that the United States is committing a genocide in the Middle East and Africa against Muslims. And while to some extent that is true, we have, just in the war in Iraq, over 2 million people died as a result of the Iraq war. And we're, of course, not talking about jihadists or Al-Qaeda members. We're talking about innocent people, the majority of which were children. And so the only way to justify these military actions is to dehumanize the victims of our war. And that's why we have the media continuously painting these caricatures of Muslims and people in Africa, really dehumanizing and demeaning caricatures of these people being as backwards and barbaric. My own parents last summer were held at gunpoint because a woman, a white suburban mom, thought that they looked suspicious. And my parents could have easily been killed that day. But this woman had said to them, what are you doing in in this neighborhood? Because they were sitting in a car waiting to pick up my brother. You look suspicious. I know you're kind. And so we're taking these caricatures of Muslims as these, jihadists that are trying to kill and, maim anything that's, not Muslim is absolutely outrageous. And in fact, all of these wars are fueling that hate that are coming from these jihadist groups. But if you actually look at, for example, who these jihadist groups are targeting, they're actually targeting Muslims, and they're killing Muslims by the thousands. And so I think that's really the root of the problem here is this caricature that we're framing about Muslims to justify these endless wars.
Well, it's Wednesday, March 16th, and yesterday was Super Tuesday, where I predict that we'll see a shift now in the election between what will probably be mostly Hillary Clinton and Donald Trump, and it's now the framework is going to go back to foreign policy, because that's where the right always takes the argument, is that they want to make the Democrat look weak. So they're going to try to make fear look like it's at our doorstep. And it's going, what are the issues that you feel need to be gotten out there with regards to the Middle East and our foreign policy that mainstream media is not getting out there? And if you can't get into too much of all of it, I'll make sure there's links to it. But
right.
You and I talked about this before. We're watching these debates, and there's either no discussion on foreign policy, or it's the wrong discussion on foreign policy. So how do you try to frame it?
Right, and you make a very good point. I mean, I think the two problems we're seeing is either there's no discussion, there's no mention of foreign policy issues, or they're dancing around the subject. These candidates are dancing around the subject. Or else we'll have candidates who actually do talk about foreign policy, like Jill Stein of the Green Party, or Gary Johnson of the Libertarian Party, who reject the military-industrial complex, and they're completely ostracized and excluded from the debates. And it's because of their stance against the war machine. But the military-industrial complex, more specifically, needs to be at the forefront of all of these conversations. Of course, we can't expect that because the candidates from both parties, whether it's Democrats or Republicans, are completely bought and sold by this industry. And so one of the things that we need to see from candidates who are really trying to get those, liberal voters like Bernie Sanders is to make foreign policy front and center of their platform. And I think many of us can agree that Bernie Sanders is taking on the issues of the elite and the global, the national oligarchy and all of those issues at the forefront. But he's really, really shying away from talking about foreign policy issues. And that's because when foreign policy issues are brought up, you are looked at as an outsider, just like when Ron Paul did. He spoke about the empire, he spoke about the war machine, and he was ridiculed by the Republican Party. And ironically, of course, he ran under the Republican Party. And so when we hear candidates like Hillary Clinton, who's blaming Bush for his policies overseas, I can't help but laugh because, Bush did ignite and initiate the war on terror, but Obama and her policies that have aligned herself with countries like Egypt and Saudi Arabia and Qatar and other human rights abusers in the region is exactly why the Middle East is in its place in the first place. It's because of her policies and the Democratic Party's policies. So when I look at candidates that are head-to-head with each other, like Hillary Clinton or Marco Rubio, they might as well be running under the same neocon party because they're actually advocating for the same thing, which is a continuation of aid and alliances with countries like Apartheid Israel, continuing to fund and arm Apartheid in Israel, continuing to ally ourselves with countries like Saudi Arabia, which has acted as a proxy to us and is basically wreaking havoc across the Middle East with funding and arming of jihadist groups, quashing dissent and destabilizing countries like it's done in Syria, and practically committing genocide in countries like Yemen. And so when I hear these candidates say that, it's the Republicans that have waged more war, the Democrats have wage more war. It's the same policies that are being spewed by both parties. So nothing is really, really going to change. And I think that if we really care about changing our foreign policy, we need to ask candidates like Bernie Sanders to really make that at the center of his campaign.
Well, Bernie Sanders and Elizabeth Warren are seen as progressives in the Democratic Party. And what I think they've done well for the narrative is they've described how Wall Street and corporations control politicians. But where they won't go in the conversation is not only the military-industrial complex, but they won't take it into what America has been doing in facilitating Israel and apartheid in Palestine. And so what I've noticed in the seeing how people are picking up on the information, they might understand, well, what we're doing is we shouldn't be giving $3.5 billion conservatively to Israel. We shouldn't be giving any money to Israel, is what some people would think. We should be spending it back at home. They might understand that there's a military-industrial complex and it's trillions of dollars that aren't being spent on domestic programs. But I think there's this cognitive dissonance that's going on with Americans trying to understand the moral complications with regards to Israel. The reason most politicians will say they're supporting Israel is because it's a democratic ally in the Middle East. Ray McGovern, who I interviewed last week, said that our foreign policy is dictated by the military, industrial, congressional, security, and media complex and the Israeli neocons. As a Palestinian journalist who is in the United States reporting on the news, what is going on with this conversation on apartheid that once someone like me who's running for office starts to talk about apartheid in Israel, I'm labeled as being an anti-Semitic. If I'm trying to promote boycott, divestment, and sanctions, and I'm trying to say that we should be not giving money to people who are committing war crimes, who aren't willing to talk to us about their nuclear arsenal and keep it public, that's anti-Semitic. What can you say to the listeners as a Palestinian to make them understand why this is used as a red herring?
Well, of course, there's no one more anti-Semitic than Israel, who is literally has taken up a war and made killing of Semite Palestinians a business. And so the use of this term anti-Semite is an ad hominem attack. I mean, it's really the only way that they can quash dissent, and instead of arguing or having a respectable adult conversation about, is Israel an apartheid state? How are these policies affecting world events or contributing to the ethnic cleansing of an indigenous people? These politicians and these media pundits will immediately label you as an anti-Semite. But in fact, we have today, I'm glad you mentioned the BDS movement, because even just today, actually you sent me this article, we have leading Senate Democrats like Harry Reid who have released a statement equating boycotting apartheid in Israel to anti-Semitism. And I just have to laugh at that, because really, what is more anti-Semitic than Israel's policy of murdering these innocent people in Palestine? When it comes to Israel and the Israeli lobby are very, very sophisticated. They have weaved their way through into American politics, through think tanks, through literally placing pundits in media, in magazines, in newspapers to defend Israel and to quiet and quash any sort of dissent or any criticism of Israel. In fact, when we saw Operation Protective Edge, when Israel had waged war against Gaza, we saw the media firsthand giving unlimited airtime space to Israeli politicians and the Israeli lobby to justify that war. And rarely did we hear from Palestinians what was going on the ground. And so now we have candidates like yourself or like, Jill Stein, who are actually standing up and saying we need to end aid and military assistance to Israel, and we need to support a one-state solution where, Muslims and Jews and Christians, everybody lives together in peace. Immediately you're going to get, excluded from the debates, and you're going to get excluded and ostracized, and you're going to even be ridiculed and labeled as some sort of radical. And I see that as happening right now, and that's why we're really waiting to see if Bernie Sanders will accept this invitation from AIPAC, because I think he will really let down his followers and the progressives that support him, who say that he is opposed to war. But Israel is one of the biggest exporters of war, not just in Palestine, but Israel has a very, very dark history. It's consistently, and until now, aiding genocide in Myanmar. It's arming the Myanmar government. It's aiding the police in police state strategies. It helped fuel conflict in Sudan to secure its oil resources and access to oil in Sudan. It aided and helped and armed the South African regime recently in South Africa as the police state. It's done the same with Colombia. It has done the same with Israel. Has done the same in helping quash dissent and arming the military in Mexico. So it's not just Palestine that's really at hand here. It's a global conflict that we're seeing with Israel, and so this is really Bernie Sanders' chance to say that he rejects the military-industrial complex, he's going to reject aid to Israel. So we'll see what happens.
I get in a lot of discussions where people think that Bernie is not talking about those subjects because it would backfire against him, and I personally think that if he embraced a foreign policy that you and I are describing here, he'd actually get greater support and more people fighting for him, because the way I kind of write it off is I think there's only so many topics that people can understand and really embrace. There's a lot of progressive news outlets who've embraced Bernie Sanders, but he just doesn't seem to go there. And I also think people have to realize the context is you have mainstream media asking questions or not asking questions, and they're always going to stay away from that topic. During the 51-day war 2 summers ago, we watched that there was no discussion on the Palestinian side, and the MSNBC basically let go one of their only Palestinian foreign analyst, Rula Jabral, in a discussion on all of that. So could you kind of help clarify for me the relationship between Saudi Arabia and Israel and how it's gotten so cozy over the last several years?
Sure. Well, currently Saudi Arabia and Israel are talking about opening up a Saudi embassy inside Israel. Since the 6-day Israeli-Arab war, the United States brokered a peace deal between the two countries. And Saudi Arabia, of course, was suspicious of Israel's creation in the Middle East. But in fact, both Israel and Saudi Arabia are both colonial projects of Britain and the United States. So they're really two sides of the same coin. They're both police states. They're both engaged in arming and fomenting civil strife in other neighboring countries. And especially if they have resources like oil and gas. But Israel and Saudi Arabia have trade deals. They exchange weapons. They sell each other weapons, as well, and they stand together against creating a peace deal between the United States and Iran. And while Saudi Arabia likes to present itself as this Islamic country, it is a radical country, and so is Israel. It's a radical Jewish state, just like Saudi Arabia is a radical Islamic state. Both, again, were creations, and their ideologies were creations of the United States and Britain. And that's, I think, a really unfortunate trend that we're seeing, is that we're seeing NATO and Western countries prop up these right-wing regimes like we see in Saudi Arabia and in Israel and across Africa and other countries as well. And so that's really why they're really just two sides of the same coin.
Well, I know we're going to run out of time, so I want our listeners to understand that I get to be a connoisseur of foreign policy in the news, and I think Mnar's website, MintPress News, is one of the leading groups in, I hate to call it alternative news or independent news. I just think she's brilliant at what she does. She frames the discussions very well. She works very hard, and you can hear from her personal story where her passion's coming from and getting the truth out there. She started out from her heart and worked into what's called activist journalism. This is an opportunity for all of us to be doing this and getting the word out about taking your iPhones and using your knowledge and informing your friends and family. The other thing that Mnar is really dedicated to is again what I've tried to framework in this conversation is we're getting droned out in a monologue by mainstream media of what they want us to be fed and understood. And here you have people who are working for next to nothing and trying to explain what's going on. This is not a profession where you go into it because you're going to get rich. You go into it because you're fighting for justice. And Mnar, I'd like to let you have the final word, but I just want to, again, as you know, I can never thank you enough for how you've been continuously growing and framing the conversation. I forgot to mention that your show Behind the News is now starting to get out in dish and cable. It's on free speech television, so you're going to see a lot more of her work. But again, back to our listeners, can you give them a call to action and what they could be doing in the next few months in order to expand the narrative?
Absolutely. I think one of the most important things is that we should continuously and constantly question the news that we're being fed about, it doesn't have to be about around the world, but even about the movements that are taking place here in our country. And so we have to remember that we have 6 corporations controlling over 90% of what we see, hear, and read in this country. And it's our job, it's our duty to step back and have a paradigm shift, really shake up our understanding of the world and our communities, and turn to alternative media, get the raw, real material or news and material, and question things for ourselves and educate ourselves. Behind the Headline is a new show that I just launched. It's a citizen-led project. It's an umbrella project of MintPress News, and it's going to be launching on Free Speech TV, on Dish and Direct TV in April. We are looking for patrons to support and sustain the show, so if anybody's interested, they can continue to support alternative and independent news on our Patreon page and also on our website. Thank you so much, Arn, for having me.
Thank you. I forgot to say something that she points out very well, and it's one of those parts that everybody says, well, it's numbers. I'm going to link you to some of Mnar's shows where she talks about up to 8 million people in the Middle East have been killed over the last 35 years in war. This is a weapons or war-based economy that we're trying to describe in our conversations. They don't want us to know and understand all of the details and the budgets. The defense budget has never been audited. So real people are being killed because peace is not profitable. Please get involved in this and let people understand that you have in your heart the compassion to save others. Thank you, Mnar. Thanks. You're amazing. Amazing. Thank you.